The Apache woman hunted the cowboy in the lonely woods, then chose him as her husband. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Clint hadn't planned on being this deep into the pine woods by sundown, but game had been scarce for days and his belly was empty. He'd been tracking a pair of deer since late morning. Scuff tracks along the ridgeline, a scrape on a tree, maybe a day old, and they'd led him farther south than he meant to go that he wasn't from these parts. He'd been drifting for years, from New Mexico to northern Arizona, then west through dry valleys and half-dead towns. He hadn't had a steady roof since before the winter of '79, and even that was a stretch. Now, it was early autumn, 1882. The air carried a warning chill. Nights were colder, darker. Clint had no home, no job lined up, no plan except to survive another week. That he moved slow and careful through the trees, one hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle, eyes scanning the underbrush. He wasn't sure where the deer had gone, but he was tired of feeling useless. He needed meat. If he didn't catch something soon, he'd have to head east and beg for work, and he'd done enough begging in his life to know what it did to a man's spine. He stepped lightly over a patch of dry brush and scanned ahead, shoulders tense, boots silent. Then it hit. A sharp crack snapped through the stillness. Rope yanked tight around his right leg, and before he could react, he was slammed backward. The breath punched from his lungs as his body hit the ground hard. The forest spun. His hat flew off. His revolver slid several feet from his outstretched hand. God, he choked, blinking up at the sky. The wind knocked clear from him. His hands went to his leg instinctively, but the snare was tight and biting. He writhed, boots scraping pine needles and cold dirt. He'd walked into a trap, and someone had set it. Then he saw her. Movement, quiet, deliberate, just past the line of trees. A figure stepped into view, bow drawn, arrow aimed straight at his chest. Clint froze that it was a woman now, maybe mid-20s. Apache by the look of her, bronze skin, high cheekbones, long black hair falling messily around her shoulders. Her eyes were dark and unreadable. She wore a torn deerskin dress, handmade, patched in places, neckline frayed and fallen slightly. The whole thing looked worn from hard use, the kind of thing a person wore not to be seen, but to survive. Clint didn't move. His leg throbbed. His heart pounded. He thought about diving for the revolver, but she had him dead to rights. The bowstring was drawn, her stance steady. No tremble in her arms. Whoever she was, she'd done this before. All right, Clint said, voice hoarse, hands open. Ain't here to cause trouble. She didn't answer. Just stared at him like she was weighing something. He tried again, more cautious this time. Just hunting, passing through. I ain't got nothing worth talking. Still nothing. She didn't speak. Instead, she circled around slowly, eyes never leaving his face. She used the tip of her arrow to slide his revolver farther away, then picked it up and tucked it into a cloth satchel at her hip. Clint's muscles tensed, ready for a fight, but she was already moving again, pulling out a length of coarse rope from behind her belt. She knelt beside him and, without ceremony, began tying his wrists. Clint didn't resist. He could have. He was stronger, but something in her expression stopped him cold. She wasn't angry. She wasn't panicked. She looked resigned, focused, like she'd been doing this same routine for a long time, not out of violence, but out of necessity. His wrist stung as the rope dug in. He looked at her up close now, dirt under her nails, a cut on her collarbone that hadn't healed right, lips cracked and dry. She hadn't eaten well in weeks. When she finished binding him, she stood and cut the snare loose with a knife that looked just as battered as the rest of her gear. Then, with a gesture of her chin, she told him to walk. Clint grunted but obeyed. He was still limping as he followed her through the trees. The rope around his wrists made his fingers tingle. He tried to look around, map out the terrain, but she kept close behind, prodding once when he slowed too much that he didn't speak again. She didn't either. They walked for maybe 15 minutes. Then the forest opened up. A small clearing sat nestled against a wall of dark rock. A crude tent stood at the center, made of canvas, deerskin, and patched hide. Smoke rose from a hole in the top. It wasn't much. No fence, no horse, no signs of other people. just a battered little home in the middle of nowhere. She motioned him forward again. Inside, it was cramped and sparse. A bedroll, a pile of fur pelts, a fire pit made of stones. A clay pot sat on the edge of the coals, steam rising from it. There were no decorations, no tools, just survival. She pointed to the ground. Sit. Clint Saturday then. To his surprise, she brought him water, held it out without speaking. When he hesitated, she stepped closer and set the cup in his bound hands. He drank slowly, unsure what to make of her. The water was warm, tasted of clay and smoke, but it helped settle the tightness in his chest. She stirred the pot, then ladled something into a wooden bowl. Thin stew, roots, a bit of squirrel, maybe boiled until soft. She crouched in front of him and loosened his rope just enough so he could lift the bowl that he ate. She sat across from him in silence, watching that Clint's mind spun. What the hell was this? She trapped him, disarmed him, bound his hands. Yet now she was feeding him, giving water, sharing food. She didn't act like someone trying to punish him. She looked tired, cautious, alone that he watched her as she turned to tend the fire. Her movements were quiet, precise, like she didn't waste anything. Not energy, not words. She sat close to the flames, wrapped in a worn blanket, her bow laid beside her knees. The shadows danced across her skin. He swallowed the last of the stew and set the bowl down slowly. You got a name? He asked, voice low. She turned slightly. Her eyes flicked to him, and she tapped her chest. Ayoka. He nodded. Clint. No further reply, but something shifted in her gaze. Just a flicker of understanding, or maybe curiosity. When night fully fell, she moved to the flap and dropped a fur curtain over the entrance. The wind whistled outside. Coyotes howled in the distance. She pulled her blanket tighter and pointed at the bedroll. Clint raised an eyebrow. That for me. She gave one nod. He stared at her for a long moment, unsure if he was a prisoner or a guest. But his body ached from the fall, and the warmth from the fire made it harder to stay angry. He laid down slowly, careful not to provoke. She sat on the other side, legs drawn under her blanket, her face turned toward the flames. He studied her in the dim light, the way her lashes fluttered slightly, how her fingers tensed on the edge of the pelt. And he wondered what had made her like this. Why she was alone, why she hadn't killed him. Then, for the first time in weeks, Clint's shoulders started to relax. He didn't understand what this was yet, who she was, or what she wanted from him. But she hadn't hurt him. She hadn't left him to freeze. She'd fed him, given him a name. He closed his eyes, but didn't sleep just yet. He was still trying to understand if the ropes on his wrists were the only thing keeping him here. Clint woke to the sound of movement, soft and careful, the kind of movement a person made when they didn't want to be noticed. The tent was still dim, lit only by the coals of the fire, and his back ached from sleeping on uneven ground. The ropes around his wrists were still there, loosely tied now, but intact. He kept still for a few seconds, eyes adjusting. Ayoka was crouched by the fire, stirring the pot with a wooden stick. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid now. Those strands had slipped free and hung against her cheek. She wasn't watching him. She moved with quiet purpose, adding dried leaves into the pot, adjusting the heat, checking a small bundle of herbs laid out beside her on a strip of cloth. Clint's stomach growled, loud enough to be heard. She glanced over once, then went back to the pot. He sat up slowly, careful not to startle her. His joints were stiff, but nothing broken. His leg throbbed from the snare, though the swelling hadn't worsened overnight. He reached down to touch his ankle, then stopped. His boots were still on. She hadn't stripped him of anything, just his gun that he cleared his throat. What is this place? Ayoka didn't answer. Instead, she poured some of the broth into a bowl and set it down near him, then backed away and sat across the fire again. Her gaze met his for a moment, steady, unreadable. Before she dropped her eyes to the flame, he picked up the bowl. Hot again. Thicker this time, small chunks of meat, better flavor. Not rabbit. Squirrel. Maybe that AS he ate. He kept glancing at her, watching, studying. She wasn't much older than mid-20s, but her face looked older somehow, worn from hard seasons, not years. Her clothes were worn thin, her dress torn near the shoulder, and her feet were wrapped in rough hide moccasins that had clearly been patched more than once. Everything about her said survival, raw, unpolished, urgent. When the food was gone, he set the bowl down and shifted slightly closer to the fire. "You live here alone?" She didn't look up, but after a pause, she nodded once. "Why?" he asked. Not accusing, just trying to understand. She seemed to hesitate, then tapped her own chest lightly. "Ayoka," she said again, voice soft. Then she pointed outward, past the tent wall, and made a sweeping motion with her hand. "No, tribe." Clint understood enough. "They cast you out." She nodded slowly. "Long time." He sat back, letting the answer settle. That was something he hadn't expected. She wasn't just hiding from the world, she'd been pushed out of it. "What for?" he asked, keeping his tone careful. She didn't answer this time. Just looked into the fire. Clint didn't push. Whatever it was, wasn't something she could explain in broken English. Or maybe she just didn't want to. And hell, he understood that better than most. Some stories weren't meant to be told. Not to strangers. He rubbed his wrists where the rope had left marks. Then looked at her. "You gonna keep me tied forever?" Ayoka hesitated. Then, slowly, she crawled over and reached for the rope. He didn't flinch. She untied it, carefully, not meeting his eyes. His hands were free now. She'd taken a risk that he didn't run. Didn't threaten her. Just flexed his fingers, feeling the blood return. Then looked her in the eye. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, flat and plain. Ayoka didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened just slightly. Later that day, when the sun had climbed higher and the tent grew too warm, Ayoka pushed open the flap and stepped outside. Clint followed, not too close, but enough to keep her in sight. The clearing was wider than he thought. On one side was a creek, narrow but steady, with cold water running over smooth stones. On the far end, the edge of the forest thickened again into dark pine. No trails, no horses, no tools left behind by others. He watched as Ayoka checked a snare near the tree lean, empty, and reset it with practiced fingers. She moved confidently through the space, like someone used to being alone, like someone who had no one else. "Where's your family?" he asked suddenly. She paused, straightened, then said, barely audible, "Gone." Clint felt a knot in his chest. He didn't ask again. Instead, he walked toward the stream and knelt by the edge, splashing cold water over his face. The bite of it woke him up fully. When he turned, he saw Ayoka watching him from a distance. Not fearful, just watchful. Measuring, he stood slowly and took a step closer. "You could have left me in that snare," he said. "Could have taken my gun and sent me off." Ayoka didn't move. "You stay," she said finally, the words slow and thick on her tongue. Then she pointed at the ground. "Not safe. Men come. Look for things." Clint frowned. "Men?" She nodded. "2 men. Horse. 1 gun. Yesterday." Clint's jaw tensed. He'd crossed paths with a pair of men outside of Winslow 2 days back. Drunks with bad intentions who didn't like strangers. He'd lost them in the hills, but maybe not for long. Oh, that was it. She wasn't just trapping animals. She was trapping danger before it came too close to her tent. And he was the one who'd stepped into it. Back at the fire, she handed him his revolver. Not the bullets, just the gun. A test, maybe. Trust that he looked at it. Then looked at her and handed it back. "You kept me alive," he said. "That's more than most would do." She looked at the revolver in her hands, then tucked it back into her pouch. Not smiling, but something in her posture softened. That night, the wind howled harder. Clint laid closer to the fire. Ayoka was just a few feet away, her blanket pulled tight. Neither of them spoke much. The language barrier still made things slow, but gestures filled in the gaps. A nod, a glance, a shared bowl. Clint watched her as she drifted to sleep. He'd never meant to find anyone out here. He didn't want to owe anyone either. But something about her, the way she looked at him without fear, the way she'd chosen not to leave him out in the woods, stuck with him. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like leaving either. He laid back, arms behind his head, and stared up at the smoke curling toward the roof of the tent. Tomorrow, he figured, they'd figure out how to survive together, even if they didn't have all the words yet. Morning came with a slow gray light seeping through the hide flap of the tent. A chill hung in the air, not sharp enough for frost, but enough to see your breath if you looked for it. Clint sat up first, stiff from sleeping on the ground again. The fire had burned low during the night, just a bed of glowing coals now. Ayoka was still asleep, her back to him, the blanket pulled up to her shoulders, long black braid trailing behind her. Clint moved quietly, feeding a few dry twigs into the coals, then a thicker branch. The fire caught again with a low crackle. He rubbed warmth into his hands and glanced toward her. She hadn't stirred. Her breathing was steady. Peaceful that he didn't want to admit it, but it felt strange having someone close again. Not just passing by on the trail, not just bartering a few words in a saloon, or drifting through a bunkhouse for a week. Someone in arm's reach. Someone who'd looked him in the eyes, fed him, watched him, trusted him. At least a little. He hadn't had that in years, by the time the fire grew stronger. Ayoka shifted and sat up slowly. Her eyes found Clint already awake, and she nodded once in greeting. No words, but that small gesture said enough. She pulled on her moccasins, stretched her shoulders, then pointed to the pot beside the fire and made a simple gesture. Food. Clint gave a short nod and handed her the ladle. He watched as she stirred the broth, sniffed it, then added a pinch of dried herbs from a small pouch. He hadn't seen that pouch before. She must have kept it hidden somewhere outside the tent. "Will you keep your things?" he asked. She looked at him, thinking, then pointed toward a patch of rocks behind the tent. "There," she said. "Hide from bad men." Clint nodded slowly. It made sense. If she had to leave in a hurry, she didn't want to lose everything. After breakfast, thicker stew again, a few pieces of dried root, still nothing much. They left the tent. The wind had picked up, but the sun was trying to break through. Clint followed her to the creek, where she checked 2 snares. One had caught a rabbit. She lifted it by the ears, killed it quickly with a rock to the skull, and dropped it into a woven satchel without flinching. "You've done this a long time," Clint said, watching her. Ayoka gave a soft sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "Since girl." He looked at her carefully. "How long have you been alone?" She didn't answer right away. Her face turned toward the trees. Then she said, 3 winters. Maybe more. He shook his head, impressed despite himself. "That's a long damn time to survive without help." Ayoka shrugged one shoulder. "No choice. They say, I bring death. Bad luck." Clint's brow furrowed. "Why?" She didn't look at him. "My brother died. Then fire. Then sickness." She hesitated. "They say I cursed." He stared at her, not sure what to say. Frontier folk believed in all kinds of things. Omens, spirits, signs in the wind. Some Apache bands were no different. If bad things piled up around someone, people turned fast. He'd seen it before. He'd seen it happen to children, to women, to old men left behind. "You don't look cursed to me," Clint said plainly. Ayoka blinked once, then turned away, kneeling to reset the snare. They walked the creek's edge for a while. Clint noticed now just how carefully she moved, pausing often to listen, scanning for tracks, fingers always near a knife. He realized she wasn't just cautious because of him. She was always on guard, always waiting for the next danger to come around the trees. That was no way to live, but it was survival, and that was all she had. Later, back at camp, Clint rolled out a piece of canvas near the tent and began patching a hole in his coat with some spare thread from his saddlebag. Ayoka watched him for a while before quietly placing a bundle beside him. Dried sinew, better for sewing than the thin string he'd been using. "Use this," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" She paused, then pointed to her own shoulder where her dress had been sewn with the same material. "Stronger. Last longer." He nodded. "Thank you." As he worked, she sat near him, slowly pulling the fur lining from a rabbit and setting aside the meat. Her hands moved efficiently, no wasted motion. Clint spoke again, quieter this time. "You were going to leave me tied forever?" She looked up, confused at first, then shook her head slowly. "No, just wait. See if you bad." "And what did you decide?" Ayoka gave a faint smile. "The first real one. Not bad. Just hungry." He let out a small breath of something close to a laugh. "That's fair." But the light moment didn't last long. By mid-afternoon, Ayoka froze halfway through cutting firewood. Her head snapped toward the trees, body rigid. Clint saw it too, movement. A distant noise. Hoofbeats. Faint. 2 horses, maybe 3, but approaching fast. She dropped the axe and grabbed her bow. Clint stood up and looked toward the treeline. Bandits. Ayoka didn't answer, but her face said enough. He reached for his revolver. She hesitated, then handed him the bullets that T was trust, handed across in silence that he loaded the weapon, jaw tight. They follow me? She nodded once. Maybe. How close? Not far. They both ducked into the rocks behind the tent, low to the ground. Clint scanned the path they'd come in from. Sure enough, 2 men on horseback appeared through the trees, riding slow but with purpose. They weren't locals. They didn't belong out here. Point one of them was the same bastard Clint had seen in Winslow, the one who tried to start a fight after losing a poker hand. The other was new, younger, twitchy. Ayoka whispered, "They leave?" "Doubt it," Clint murmured. "They're looking for something. Or someone." He watched as the men paused near the creek. One dismounted, looked around. The other spat and pointed toward the clearing. "They'll find the tent," Clint said. "We wait too long. They'll circle behind us." Ayoka reached for her bowstring, knuckles tight. "We fight." He looked at her. Her dress was torn. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she was ready. No fear in her eyes. Clint checked the chamber of his revolver and nodded. "If they come closer, yeah. We fight." Ayoka's eyes didn't leave the clearing. The bandits were getting off their horses now, starting to walk slowly toward the tent. Clint tightened his grip on the gun. "You stay behind me." "No," she said. "We stand." "Both." He looked at her again. She wasn't just surviving now. She was defending something that so was he. And whatever happened next, they'd face it together. The clearing was silent, but the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. The 2 men had reached the edge of Ayoka's camp now, rifles hanging loose but ready. One of them, the older one with the scar across his chin, called out in a lazy drawl, "Nice setup you got here. Someone living out here." The younger one circled wide, eyes sharp, boots crunching pine needles. His hand kept twitching near the grip of his pistol. He didn't speak, just watched. Clint stayed low behind the rock, watching them from the brush with the barrel of his revolver resting steady on the edge of stone. Beside him, Ayoka had an arrow already nocked and drawn, the bowstring pulled tight and silent. Her breathing was slow, but her hands were steady. Clint leaned close to her ear and whispered, "We only fire if they go for their weapons first. If we fire too early, they'll shoot to kill." Ayoka gave a small nod. No panic in her eyes. Just the same cold focus he'd seen when she snared him. Scarchin stepped closer to the tent and kicked the empty bowl near the fire. "Somebody's been here. Fresh stew. Still warm." He turned to his partner. "Told you." He didn't just disappear. Then, louder, toward the trees. "Clint, I know you're out here. Why don't we talk like men?" Clint didn't answer. His fingers stayed on the trigger, but he didn't press it. He watched every move they made, calculating angles, cover, how many shots he had left. 6. 5 after the first. The younger one moved toward the back of the tent. "Too close," Clint hissed through his teeth. "They flank us. We're done." Ayoka moved before he could stop her. Quiet as a cat, she slid out of cover and into the shadows behind the tent, drawing her knife with her free hand. She wasn't waiting to be attacked. She was going to cut off the flank before it formed. Clint moved, too, just a few feet to the left, shifting his angle so he could see both men now. His revolver was aimed at Scarchin, who stood in the open. "Last warning," Clint called out. "You need to turn around. You don't know what's next." The older man froze mid-step. He turned slowly, lips curling. "Well, hell, there he is." Clint stepped out into the open, still behind the cover of brush. "You follow me all this way for what? I don't owe you anything. You owe me 2 nights of lost sleep and a busted nose. That's what," the man snarled. "And word is you're holding out on a payout." "There's no payout. Just an empty belly and cold nights." "You ain't alone," the younger man called from behind the tent. "We saw her." Clint's jaw tightened. He hadn't wanted them to see her. He raised his voice. "She's not part of this. You turn around now, no one gets hurt." But it was too late. The younger one rushed forward, weapon half raised, and that's when Ayoka stepped out from behind the tent and slammed the butt of her bow into the side of his head. The man crumpled. Clint fired the same instant. One clean shot, echoing through the pines, and Scarchin dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder, the rifle clattering out of his grip. Blood soaked through his coat, but it wasn't a kill shot. Ayoka moved fast, knife ready, dragging the younger man's pistol away and kicking it into the brush. Clint stepped closer, gun still raised. Scarchin spat blood into the dirt. "You're gonna regret this. You got no law out here." "I don't need law," Clint said. "I've got enough reason." Ayoka stood behind him now, arrow still drawn, silent and still. Her presence was no longer hidden, no longer cautious. She was standing in the open now, beside him. "You're gonna kill me?" the man growled. Clint stared at him a long time, then lowered the gun. "No, but you're not coming back. You head east now, and if I see either of you again, I won't ask twice." He nodded toward the unconscious man. "Take him and go." Scarchin struggled to his feet, grabbing his partner by the collar. Blood soaked through the cloth. He gave Clint one last glare, then staggered off the way they'd come. Clint waited until the sound of hose faded into the trees. Then he finally let out a long breath and lowered the revolver for good. Ayoka was already putting the bow down, her body relaxing all at once. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "You?" He rolled his shoulder. "Fine." They stood there a moment, just looking at each other. Something had shifted. It wasn't about being prisoner or guest anymore. They'd stood back to back, faced real danger, chosen not to run. Clint bent to pick up the down man's second pistol. He checked the chamber, loaded, then looked at her. "You should keep this." Ayoka took it without hesitation. She checked it with the same calm hands she used to clean snares. It was clear she'd used one before. Later that evening, they sat by the fire again. The stew pot simmered low. Ayoka worked quietly, stitching a fresh tear in the side of her dress. Clint sat across from her, the firelight dancing across his face, lines of dirt and smoke smudging his jaw. "Why'd you stop me from shooting him dead?" he asked finally. She looked up, her words careful. "If we kill, more come. Always more." He nodded slowly. "You're right." She hesitated, then pointed to her chest. "You stay." Clint looked at her, long and serious. "I stay." She didn't smile, but something in her eyes eased. That night, they didn't speak much. But when the cold crept in, she laid a second blanket near the fire, just close enough to his. And for the first time, she didn't turn her back. They weren't strangers anymore, and neither of them was alone. The next morning came colder than any before, a sign the season was turning for Real. Clint woke early to the sound of Ayoka stepping outside the tent, her feet crunching over frost-hardened soil. The fire had burned down to cold ash. He pulled his coat tight, rolled to his feet, and ducked out after her. She was at the creek, kneeling, washing the blood-stained cloth she'd used to clean Clint's revolver the night before. Her braid had come loose in the wind, and for a moment, she looked younger, less guarded. But her eyes, when she turned to look at him, were still watchful. Clint crouched near her, filling his cupped hands with water and splashing his face. He let the cold bite, let it clear his head that he needed to talk to her. Not just about what happened yesterday, but about what came next. They hadn't spoken about it yet. Not directly. They'd fought together, yes. Protected each other. But neither had asked the question both of them were circling. "Those men," Clint said. "They won't forget what happened here." Ayoka's hands stilled in the water. "More come." "Could be," he said. "Or maybe not. But we should be ready." She nodded once, then pointed to the line of trees north of camp. "I know place. Higher. Rock cover. Safe." Clint followed her gesture. "You thinking we move camp?" She looked at him for a moment, then shook her head. "No move. Just place to hide. If danger." Clint rubbed his jaw. "Good. We'll clear the path. Build something up there. A shelter, even if small." She hesitated, then added quietly, "You stay still." He looked at her. "I told you I would." "But now?" she asked. "Now after fight?" He didn't answer right away. He thought about it. About the road behind him. About the nothing waiting for him if he walked out of this forest. No job. No land. No one to remember his name. And this woman, who had risked her life for him, even before she could speak his language right. "I'm not going anywhere," Clint said. "I'm not leaving you out here alone." That day they worked side by side. Clint chopped wood while Ayoka repaired the tent seams with deer sinew. They hiked to the overlook she'd mentioned, a narrow ledge tucked behind a wall of rock, hard to see unless you were standing right on top of it. From up there, they could see for miles. The trees opened into a long valley, and the creek cut through it like a vein. Clint gathered stones and started building a low wall. Ayoka brought dried moss and brush to cover it. They didn't speak much, but the rhythm of working together, passing tools, stepping around each other, catching glances in the quiet, meant more than words. Later, back at camp, Clint tried to teach her how to use the extra revolver properly. She'd held guns before, but not with much training. He watched her grip, corrected her stance, showed her how to brace the recoil. She was a quick learner. Focused, barely blinked when the gun fired. By the third shot, her grouping was tight enough to impress him. "You ever shot a man?" he asked. She didn't answer. Just looked down at the revolver in her hands, thought he didn't push. That night, they sat near the fire again, but closer now. Clint handed her a strip of cooked meat and noticed she took it without hesitation. The way her body leaned slightly toward his, not away. "You trust me yet?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. "I watch. I listen. I see your hands. Your eyes." He waited. "Not like other men." She finished. He nodded once. "That's good. Because I ain't leaving. Not now. Not until you say go." She tilted her head. "You stay because you want." Clint looked at her, serious. "I stay because I choose. Same as you." That answer mattered. He saw it in the way her expression changed. Not much, just the faintest drop in her shoulders. But it was the first time she let her hand rest near his on the ground, close enough to feel the heat. He didn't move away. Before they turned in for the night, she reached into the pouch where she kept her few personal things and pulled out a carved piece of bone. Small, shaped like a bird, tied with a strip of leather. She handed it to him. "For protection," she said. "For you." Clint turned it in his fingers, surprised by the detail in it. Simple but careful. He met her eyes. "You made this?" She nodded. "I'll keep it," he said. He tied it to the strap of his revolver holster. Later, they lay down side by side, blankets touching. There were still questions. Still things they couldn't say in each other's language. But neither of them pulled away that they'd started as strangers. Then captor and captive. Then survival partners. Now, it was something else, something quiet, something permanent. And neither of them wanted to name it just yet. It was nearly a week before another threat came. And by then, things between Clint and Ayoka had changed in ways neither of them spoke aloud, but both understood clearly. They rose at the same hour, split firewood together, walked the trap line side by side. They ate their meals close, shared the same tools, and by the third night, Clint stopped sleeping on the opposite side of the fire. She never asked him to move closer. He just did. That morning began quiet, same as the others. Clint was cleaning a rabbit they'd caught near the ridge while Ayoka sharpened her knife on a flat stone by the creek. It was the kind of morning that might have passed without note. Wind in the trees, crows calling high above, fire crackling low, but Clint felt it before he heard it. A shift, a stillness, something wrong in the silence that he stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "You hear that?" Ayoka paused mid-motion. Then she nodded once. Her eyes flicked toward the east trail, hoofbeats, distant but steady. Not a rider passing through, not a lost traveler. Purposeful. Clint reached for his revolver. "Stay here. I'll check the ridge." Ayoka didn't argue. She reached for her bow and moved low into the brush, circling toward their overlook. They'd prepared for this, built the shelter in case of trouble, but hadn't used it yet. Clint climbed the slope fast, boots crunching over frost-hardened dirt. He reached the edge and crouched behind the stone wall they'd built. From there, he saw them point 3 riders, not the same men as before. These ones looked worse, older, meaner. One had a rust-red bandana tied across his face and carried a repeater slung across his chest. The others rode heavy, wore worn coats, sidearms loose at their hips. They weren't riding hard, but they were riding direct, straight toward the camp. Clint clenched his jaw. "They're not looking to barter," he muttered under his breath that he waited until they were closer, then slid back down the trail, fast but quiet. Ayoka met him halfway, 3 men, he said. Rifles. Don't look like they're passing through. She frowned. You know them? No, but I know their kind. She nodded once, then turned without another word. They both moved fast, gathering what they could. Clint packed ammunition and wrapped the revolver belt tighter around his waist. Ayoka stuffed dried meat into a pouch and pulled on her hide wrap. She handed him a water skin. No panic, just readiness. They didn't run. They climbed. That be why the time the riders reached the empty camp. Clint and Ayoka were tucked behind the stone wall, watching from the overlook above. The lead rider dismounted and walked around the tent slowly. Somebody's been living here, he said, voice flat but loud enough to carry. Fire's still warm. Think it's that cowboy, one of the others asked. Could be. Or maybe the girl they talked about. That Apache which out here alone. Clint's eyes darkened. They're looking for you. Ayoka didn't react, just lowered her face behind the stone and listened. The third man kicked over the clay pot, spilling cold stew into the dirt. Ain't no one here. The leader turned toward the trees. They're close. I can smell it. Clint looked at Ayoka. We take the shot now. We can drop one. Maybe two. Ayoka hesitated. Then fight. Long time. He nodded. Or we let them leave. If they leave. She looked at him, her face hardening. If they take camp, they take food. My bow. Everything. She was right. This wasn't just an attack. It was theft. Survival. Clint raised the revolver slowly, eyes narrowed. When I fire, you move left. I'll draw them this way. You flank. Ayoka drew an arrow, muscles tight, every inch of her focused. Ready. The first shot cracked across the valley. The man by the tent dropped instantly, Clint's bullet catching him in the side. The others shouted, spinning to return fire, but they didn't know where it had come from. Ayoka moved through the trees like smoke, bowstring drawn. She released one arrow, fast and clean, catching the second rider in the leg. He screamed, stumbled. Clint ducked as a rifle slug tore through the brush beside him. He rolled left, fired again. Missed. The third rider scrambled for cover, panicked. He shouted to the others. They're up high, in the rocks. But it was too late. Ayoka had moved again. Another arrow hit the man in the chest. He went down gasping, clawing at the shaft. The last one bolted, grabbed the reins of the only surviving horse, and rode hard out the way they came, not looking back once. Clint stood slowly, revolver still raised, heart pounding in his chest. Ayoka emerged a moment later, breathing hard, blood on her sleeve. Not hers. They looked down at the camp point, 2 men dead. One gone to... It wasn't the first time Clint had seen death up close. But it had been a long time since it felt this sharp. This personal. He looked at her. You all right? She nodded. You? Fine. He lowered the gun. We can't stay here anymore. No, she said quietly. They find again. We'll take what we can carry. Move to the overlook. Build it out. Make it ours. Ayoka met his eyes. You still stay? Clint didn't even hesitate. I'm not going anywhere. She didn't speak, just stepped closer. Her hand touched his sleeve, then his wrist. That night, they buried the bodies far from the creek and burned what they couldn't use. Ash rose into the trees. By the time the fire died, their camp was empty, cold, and left behind. They climbed to the ridge with everything they had left between them. Clint carried the rifle. Ayoka carried the last of the broth. They didn't look back. There was nothing behind them worth returning to, only what they were building ahead. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Clint and Ayoka had already begun laying the first stones of their new shelter on the overlook. The old tent was gone, left behind with the rest of the life they couldn't afford to return to. Up here, the wind was colder but cleaner, and the view stretched for miles. Dense forest below, the creek winding through the pines, and far in the distance, a line of jagged hills marking the edge of the New Mexico territory. They'd chosen this place not for comfort, but for survival. Clint dug the ground flat while Ayoka gathered bark and branches from the nearby woods. They worked in rhythm now, passing tools without speaking, understanding each other through glances, simple nods, the pace of their hands. What once had been a fragile alliance was now something sturdier. Still, the work was hard. Their bodies were sore, and their food supply was thin. Clint's traps were empty 2 days running, and Ayoka's last rabbit skin had already been turned into stitching for the shelter wall. They shared smaller meals. They slept closer to stay warm, but neither complained. Later that afternoon, Clint sat on a log near the half-built shelter, sharpening his knife. He paused when he noticed Ayoka kneeling nearby, focused on a strip of hide she was carving. Her fingers moved with quiet care, and in her lap lay something he hadn't seen before. A new carving, still rough around the edges. It looked like a figure. A man this time, standing tall, one hand open, the other resting at his side. "You made that?" Clint asked. She glanced up and nodded once. He tilted his head. "Is that supposed to be me?" Ayoka gave a faint smile. "You stay," she said. "You protect." "So yes." He looked at the carving longer than he meant to. There was something humbling about it, about being seen that way, not in words, but in a shape carved with care. Clint shifted in place, clearing his throat. "I haven't had a home in years. Not since my brother died. He ran a little ranch outside of El Paso. After he passed, everything went bad. I just kept moving." Ayoka was quiet. Then she said, "You stop now?" He met her eyes. "Yeah, I think I'm ready." She nodded slowly, like that answer mattered more than anything else he'd said. That night, the shelter was only half complete, but it was enough to sleep under. They set up a fresh fire ring, built a stone windbreak, and stretched hide over a frame of thick branches. It wouldn't hold against a full storm, but it was a start. As the fire crackled, Clint reached in his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of parchment he'd kept tucked in the inside pocket for months. An old army pass from years back, with his full name printed clear across the top. He handed it to her. "Clint Rowe," she read slowly, sounding out each letter. "Rowe." He nodded. "That's me." She touched her chest. "Ayoka, no family name." Clint didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe one day, if you want, you could take mine." Her eyes flicked up to his face. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "I think I want," she said quietly. That night, the wind picked up over the ridge. It howled through the trees below, sharp and bitter. But inside their rough shelter, they stayed close under the same blanket. No ropes, no weapons between them. Ayoka's hand brushed against his. This time, Clint didn't pull away. She looked at him, steady and quiet. "You're not prisoner anymore." He smiled faintly. "You never were." Before sleep took them, she leaned in slowly and kissed him, soft, deliberate, and with no fear. His hand came to her back, holding her gently like something worth keeping. And in that moment, neither one of them was running anymore. Not from the past, not from each other. By the end of the second week on the ridge, the shelter no longer looked temporary. Clint had built up the stone wall higher, braced the roof with thick cut pine branches, and reinforced the hide walls with overlapping bark. Ayoka had added a woven reed mat for the floor, gathered herbs, and hung bundles of dried food from the rafters to keep animals out. A rough wooden crate held their tools. A second fire pit sat near the edge of the overlook, where they cooked when the wind wasn't too strong. The tea was still crude, still wild, but it was home. And for the first time in either of their lives, it belonged to them, and to no one else. That morning, Ayoka rose early to gather wood. Clint stayed behind to sharpen his blade and check the snares they'd set near the western slope. The sun was just clearing the treetops when he found a fox caught in the farthest snare. It was injured but not dead. Clint knelt slowly, watching the animal's breathing. In the past, he wouldn't have hesitated to put it down. But now, something stopped him. He remembered the way Ayoka had treated the first rabbit they'd shared. Not as meat, but as necessity. Nothing wasted. Nothing cruel. She didn't kill unless she had to. Not if there was another way. Clint reached into his pouch, pulled a cloth, and gently covered the fox's eyes. It didn't fight much. He loosened the trap slowly, careful not to tear the leg further. When the snare finally slipped free, the fox limped once, looked at him, and ran. Clint watched it vanish into the trees. He didn't say it out loud, but it felt like something had changed in him. A small thing, a choice. When he returned, Ayoka was crouched near the fire, boiling pine needles into tea. She looked up and noticed the snare was empty. "No catch?" she asked. Clint sat beside her. "Caught a fox." "Let go." She tilted her head slightly. What? Didn't feel right, he said. It wasn't for us. She said nothing. But after a moment, she poured him tea and handed it over with a quiet nod. That afternoon, they walked down into the forest together to check Ayoka's hidden stash. The one she told him about weeks before, tucked behind a line of rocks not far from the creek. Inside was a worn satchel, a bone comb, a small copper pot, and several folded pieces of tan hide. Among them, she unwrapped something new that addressed it was old, handmade from soft deerskin, decorated with small beads and fringe. It had clearly taken her months to finish, stitches tight and straight, beads arranged in careful patterns. She held it up, smoothing the front with her fingers. You made that? Clint asked. She nodded. Before. For wedding. He stared at her. You were going to be married? Her gaze dropped. Once. Long time ago. He died. He said nothing at first. Just watch her fold the dress again with care. You ever think about wearing it again? He asked. Ayoka's hands paused. Then she looked up at him, a little uncertain. Maybe, she said. If I belong again. Clint stepped closer. You do. You built all this. You made it safe. You've taken care of me. You belong. She didn't answer, but her fingers tightened around the dress. That night, they ate by the fire in silence. Clint had managed to bring down a grouse earlier in the day, and they cooked it over coals, letting the meat roast slow. Ayoka leaned into him while they ate, shoulder against his. Afterward, she stood and stepped into the shadows of the shelter. He didn't follow at first, just stared into the fire, letting the quiet fill the space between them. When she returned, she was wearing the dress. It wasn't perfect. The beading was faded, and one sleeve had come loose. But on her, it looked like it had always belonged. She stepped into the firelight slowly, eyes on him, unsure. Clint stood, watching her. You look beautiful, he said, voice rougher than he meant. She walked up to him, close, until their faces were just inches apart. Then stay, she whispered. Stay not for danger, not for shelter. Stay because you choose me. I already did, he said. But if you need to hear it, yes, I choose you. Ayoka didn't smile. She just reached for his hand and placed it over her heart. Her other hand rested on his chest. And in that moment, no words were needed. They stood there as the wind moved around them, the fire warming their faces, the forest quiet except for the soft sound of their breathing. Two people the world had cast out, now standing in the middle of it together, not by accident, but by choice. The first snow came early that year, just a light dusting at first, thin flakes falling through the pine branches, clinging to bark and stone, but it was enough to change everything. The air turned sharper. The wind moved slower but colder, and the forest quieted in that way it only did before a long season. Clint woke to find Ayoka already outside, standing near the edge of the overlook, her shoulders wrapped in a fur-lined hide. She didn't speak when he joined her, just lifted a hand toward the horizon. Smoke, thin, barely visible, far off to the west, beyond the creek and the valley. Not from lightning, not from accident. Someone had lit a fire. Clint narrowed his eyes. You think they're coming? Ayoka didn't answer right away. No, too far. Not tracking. He nodded slowly, then said what both of them were already thinking. Still need to be ready. They spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the shelter, dragging stones to build up the windbreak, sealing the seams in the roof with pine resin and more hide. Ayoka gathered roots and dried meat from their cache while Clint restocked their rifle rounds and wrapped leather around the rifle, but for extra grip. But the tension didn't last. By afternoon, the wind shifted again, and the smoke drifted east. In 01 came by evening. They were sitting near the fire, knees almost touching. The stew pot was half full, and for once there was enough food to take a second helping. Clint tore a piece of bread in half. Flatbread Ayoka had baked from crushed nuts and dried berries, and handed her the bigger piece without thinking. She took it, her fingers brushing his. You still think of leaving? She asked quietly. Clint didn't answer right away. He just looked around at everything they'd built. The fire pit, the shelter, the woven baskets, the wooden crates he'd made by hand, the string of clean pelts drying near the rock wall, the spear she'd carved and balanced perfectly. He looked back at her. No, he said. There's nothing out there I want. Ayoka watched him a long moment, then nodded. She reached in her pouch and pulled out something wrapped in hide. She placed it on his lap. Clint unfolded it slowly. Inside was a narrow strip of tanned leather, carefully stitched with white thread. It wasn't decorated, not fancy, just one word sewn across the middle in slightly uneven but strong lettering. Rodti stared at it. Ayoka said, softly, "You gave name. I keep it." Clint swallowed once. "You want me to wear this?" She shook her head. "I want us both." He looked at her face, searching for hesitation. There was none, just quiet certainty that he nodded. "Then we start fresh. Together." Later that week, before the snow deepened, they took a trip down to the abandoned creekside camp. What was left of the old tent was torn and frozen, but Clint found a few usable tools. Ayoka gathered the beads from her old blanket, tying them to her new hide wrap. Before they left, they stood beside the fire pit one last time. "No more hiding," she said. "No more running," Clint added. Back at the ridge, Clint used pine wood to carve a new post, thick, solid. He drove it into the ground beside their shelter and hung a small piece of cloth from the top. When the wind caught it, it fluttered just enough to be seen from the trail below. Ayoka stood beside him. "Now if someone comes, they know." Clint turned to her. "Know what?" She met his eyes. "That we live here, that this is home, that we are family." That night, she wore the beaded dress again. Not because it was a special night, but because she wanted to. Clint cooked rabbit over the fire. They shared it sitting shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in the same blanket. There was no more talk of danger and no more talk of leaving. Only shared silence, only warmth, only staying. When Clint finally spoke, it was in a low voice but steady. "You think your people would accept you now?" Ayoka looked into the fire. "Maybe, but I don't wait anymore." Clint leaned in, kissed her temple. "You don't need to. You have me." She looked at him, nodded once, then rested her head on his shoulder. And in the cold wind, in the middle of nowhere, the man who had once wandered without a name, and the woman once left with no place to belong, had found the one thing neither had dared to hope for, a life they chose together.